For 20 years, he lived in silence. Just him and the horse. The only creature left breathing after the avalanche buried his entire family. That horse had never bowed to anyone. Until that day. When a girl appeared, barefoot, her wedding dress soaked in mud, trembling as she whispered, "I just need to ride him." For a few minutes. And then, the horse lowered its head, as if history was about to repeat itself. Some evenings don't just pass. They linger, like they're trying to erase something memory hasn't dared to forget. That evening was one of them. The wind in Wyoming didn't howl like it did in Western novels. It whispered. But that whisper made the grass bow their heads, made the willow leaves shiver, and made a man who lived alone feel like he was surrounded by things no longer living. Silas Granger's ranch sat on the edge of a valley, where cell signals stuttered and old heartbreaks had room to echo. There, he lived with Orion, an aging warhorse the color of ash and winter smoke, bearing a long scar down his left hind leg, like a blade carved by fate. They called Silas the crazy loner who talked to his horse. But only he knew the truth. Orion didn't stand, he stood guard. Like a soul that knew too much and chose never to speak again. No one had touched Orion since the avalanche in Colorado that buried Silas's wife and son beneath 4 meters of ice. It was Orion, injured, hoof cracked, hide torn, who had screamed into the storm and dragged out the only survivor, Silas himself. To him, Orion wasn't a horse. He was a breathing tombstone, a comrade, a relic of what survived. That evening, Silas was standing beside Orion at the old wooden fence. His hand rested on the horse's neck, fingers trembling faintly, as if searching for warmth in a season that hadn't yet turned cold. The sky above was painted in a bruised crimson, like someone had slow roasted the fields in grief. Then came the sound of an engine. Distant. Out of place. A vintage silver convertible rolled into view through the red Wyoming dust, like a ghost from another era. Its tires crunched over gravel as if breaking the silence underfoot. The car stopped at the gate. Silas squinted. Orion let out a low breath, ears pricked. The door opened. And then, she stepped out. She looked like she had just walked away from a nightmare that had lasted her whole life. Barefoot. Wedding dress torn. Hair tangled like scorched prairie grass after a wildfire. And her eyes, dry but far from healed. She didn't ask who he was. Didn't apologize for showing up uninvited. She simply walked up to him, not trembling, not afraid, and said, her voice low but not empty, "I just need to ride your horse." For a few minutes, Silas didn't move. The wind paused. Even the earth seemed to hold its breath. He looked at her like a man who'd seen a ghost rising from the dust of his past. But before he could speak, Orion did something he hadn't done in 2 decades. He bowed his head. Not in submission. In recognition. As if to say, "You're running too, aren't you?" Silas opened the gate. She climbed onto Orion with an ease that felt unnatural, like she wasn't mounting a horse, but reuniting with a soul she'd once known. The wedding dress flowed down his back like a broken flag, white and torn, trailing behind them like a dove lost in a field of gold. Orion walked. Not rushed. Not hesitant. Not waiting for command. Each step felt like it was rewriting something time had tried to erase. She didn't ask where to go. She wasn't trying to arrive anywhere. She just needed to move, with that horse. One slow loop, then she returned. The last light of day caught in her hair like a flame trying not to burn. She dismounted gently, placed her hand on Orion's neck, not in gratitude, but like someone saying goodbye to the only thing that just unchained them. "Thank you," she said quietly, not looking at him. "This might have just saved me." Then she turned toward the car. But paused before opening the door. She looked back. Met his eyes for the first time, those weathered, storm-hardened eyes of a man who'd survived too much and still didn't know how to cry. "You're not going to ask me why?" Silas shrugged, voice dry as old ash. "If you wanted to tell me, you would." She let out a soft breath, a laugh, almost. The first honest sound she'd made in years. "Can I come back tomorrow?" He nodded. And in that nod, The earth tilted just a little. She left. But she didn't leave him. She left something hanging in the wind. A tiny fracture in the thick, dusty glass bottle that held his years together. And Silas knew, as Orion surely did. Something had begun. The dust from her tires had long since settled. But the silence she left behind still hadn't. Silas stayed by the fence long after the convertible disappeared down the road, Orion standing quietly beside him, as if the horse too was waiting for something. Or someone. He didn't expect her to come back. But something in him, something small and unfamiliar, was already listening for the sound of that engine again. And then, the next afternoon, it came. Not as loud. Not as startling. This time, it hummed like something familiar returning to a place it might belong. She stepped out of the car. No wedding dress. No veil. No mystery of silk trailing in the wind. She wore faded jeans, a soft flannel shirt tucked carelessly, and boots that didn't match, but looked like they'd been chosen by someone finally ready to touch the earth. Her hair was pulled back in a rough knot, and her eyes, still wide, still stormy, had changed. Not calmer. Just less afraid of what they held. Orion noticed her first. He lifted his head, gave a low exhale, and stepped forward, unprovoked. No one told him to. He simply moved. Like he remembered. Evelyn paused at the gate, one hand resting on the weathered wood. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just whispered. "Hi." Silas said nothing. Just nodded, and stepped aside. "I was wondering," she said slowly, "if I could brush him." It wasn't a question for permission, not exactly. It was something closer to hope, spoken carefully, as if afraid it might crack. Silas gave a small nod toward the barn. "Brushes are in the blue bucket, behind the feed sacks. If he lets you near them, they're yours to use." Inside the barn, dust hung in sunbeams like tiny memories floating. Evelyn moved slowly, reverently. She found the brushes, bristles worn, wood-worn from age, and walked to Orion, who stood waiting near the open stall. She raised her hand. He didn't move away. Instead, he lowered his head slightly, and Evelyn touched him like you'd touch a wound. She brushed him without speaking, shoulder to flank, neck to back, rhythmic strokes that seemed to tame something in both of them. The silence wasn't awkward. It was earned. That night, she stayed. Silas didn't ask where she'd been, or why she was back. He led her to the old guest room, a small, square space with a creaky bed and a window that looked out over the pasture. Dust lay on the windowsill like it had been waiting for someone to return. "Locks from the inside," he said simply. She nodded, holding her duffel bag tight. It was the only thing she carried. "Thank you for not asking," Silas replied without looking at her. Sometimes silence says more than questions. Evelyn lay awake that night. The sheets smelled like old cedar and dry summer. Outside the window, she could hear Orion shifting in the field, his hooves pressing gently into the earth, his breath steady. She didn't know what she was doing here. But for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was running. Not yet. Not again. Just pausing. The next morning, she was up early. Silas was already outside, repairing a section of fence that had leaned after last night's wind. He didn't say good morning. Neither did she. She picked up a hammer. Stood beside him. "Need help?" He looked at her over his shoulder, squinting against the sun. "Only if you can hold a post straight." She grinned, faint, but real, and stepped into the dirt. They worked in rhythm. Wood. Nail. Hammer. Silence. A quiet that didn't need filling. Later, sitting on the porch, coffee warming her hands, Evelyn finally spoke. "You still don't know my last name." Silas didn't look up. "Don't need to." She tilted her head, studying him. "You really don't care who I am?" He shrugged. "If you're hiding, you've got a reason. If you're lying, the truth will come out on its own." His words weren't sharp. Just solid. Like rock that had seen too many floods to be impressed by storms. Evelyn looked out over the pasture. Orion grazed alone, white against gold, as if he'd been painted into the land. "He makes it easier to breathe," she said. Silas followed her gaze. That horse doesn't judge. He just listens. They both knew she wasn't talking only about the horse. And for the first time, neither of them felt the need to run. Not away. Not yet. Just toward whatever this quiet might mean. The days had begun to stretch longer, but not because the sun lingered. It was because the silence between them had found a rhythm, like an old song both had once heard, but only now remembered how to hum. Evelyn stayed. She didn't explain. Silas didn't ask. Orion grazed. Watched. Waited. And in the hush between sunrise and chores, between mending fences and brushing coats, something deeper began to move, like water thawing beneath a frozen lake. One evening, after the sky had traded its fire for indigo, they sat outside near the barn. A small fire crackled between them. Orion stood nearby, tethered but relaxed, occasionally lifting his head toward the wind like he was listening for things no longer there. Silas leaned back on an old bench, his boots crossed at the ankles, a tin mug of coffee in his hands. Evelyn sat on an overturned feed bucket, sleeves rolled, hands stained with hay and sweat and something more human than she'd felt in years. She didn't know who started the story. Maybe it was the fire. Maybe it was Orion, his breath steady, his shadow long. Maybe it was the silence itself, finally ready to give something back. He wasn't always mine, you know. Silas's voice broke the night gently. Evelyn looked up. Orion. He came wild. From up near a bighorn. Herds scattered during a drought. Found him near a dried creek bed. Skin and bones. Half a hoof gone. Eyes like a storm that had stayed too long. She said nothing. Didn't need to. He kept going. Took me 3 months to get him to come near. Another 2 just to touch his neck. By the time he let me saddle him, I'd already lost more than I knew how to keep. The fire popped. My wife, Nora. And our boy, Jacob. Wildfire came through the ridge that summer. Too fast. They were in the house. He didn't look at her when he said it. Didn't look at anything. I tried. I ran. But by the time I got there, he paused. Only thing left breathing was Orion. Covered in ash. Leg torn up from breaking out the back stall. I don't know how he made it out. Just did. Silence folded over them again. But this time it was sacred. Not empty. Shared. Evelyn watched Orion, saw the long scar that ran down his flank, saw the strength in the way he stood, alert, but not tense. And something in her chest cracked. I used to name everything, she said quietly. Silas raised a brow. When I was little. My shoes, my forks, my pencils. They all had names. Because I thought if I named something, it couldn't leave me. She swallowed hard. Then I grew up in a house where everything was named for me. The school. The charities. The fiancé. She chuckled, but it came out like broken glass. They picked him because his family owned 3 banks and a vineyard in Napa. Said it was a future-proof match. Like I was a merger, not a person. Silas didn't speak. But she could feel him listening. I didn't even pick the dress, she said, shaking her head. Didn't pick the flowers. Didn't pick the song. They told me where to stand. When to smile. Even how to wave when the photographers came. She looked up, eyes dark with something between grief and rage. And then, I saw your horse. From the road. Standing there like he didn't owe anybody anything. Like he'd fought death and won. Like he'd chosen to stay. A long pause. And I remembered I used to want that. To choose something. Anything. Even just once. The fire crackled louder for a moment, as if it, too, had something to say. Orion lowered his head, nudging the dirt near Evelyn's boots, and she reached out slowly, resting her hand on his jaw. She didn't cry. But her hand trembled like she almost could. He trusts you, Silas said. He doesn't do that much. She nodded, barely. I don't know why. Maybe he sees something I forgot I had. That night, neither of them went inside right away. They sat in the silence, letting the cold settle around them. And as the stars began to bleed into the sky, something shifted between them. Not love, not yet, not even friendship, just recognition. Like two people who had once been whole, and were now not. But were beginning, slowly, to believe they might not stay broken forever. The fire had long gone out, but its warmth lingered, in the silence they'd shared, in the truths they'd dared speak. Morning arrived not with trumpets or thunder, but in a hush of dew on fence posts and sunlight slipping shyly through barn slats. Evelyn rose early, stepping barefoot onto the wooden floor of the guest room. The air was cool, filled with a scent of dust and hay. Her breath fogged against the window as she looked out. Orion stood alone in the pasture, still, silent, watching the horizon. Just like last night, just like always. That morning marked the beginning of something different. She didn't ask for it. Silas didn't assign it. But it began, anyway. Evelyn started spending every spare hour in the barn, not to tame Orion, but to learn what it meant to be near him. She cleaned his hooves, careful and quiet. She brushed his coat, not rushing even when her arms ached. She detangled his mane with fingers instead of combs. She learned how he liked the water poured, not too cold, not too fast, when she bathed him on warm afternoons. And when she rubbed salve into the old scar along his flank, she didn't speak. She just moved gently, like her touch might erase something deeper than skin. It wasn't training. It was meditation. Every motion became a form of prayer. "He'll never let you ride him until you stop trying to," Silas said one afternoon, arms crossed, leaning against the gate. Evelyn, covered in sweat and hay, looked up from where she was kneeling beside Orion's front leg. "Isn't that the point? Trying?" Silas shook his head slowly. "That's the point in a boardroom. Or a courtroom. Not with a horse. He's not something to conquer." She stared at Orion, who blinked slowly at her, unbothered by the exchange. "So what do I do?" "Be still," Silas said. "Learn to trust first. Then he might return the favor." It wasn't what she expected. It wasn't what she was taught. Her whole life had been about mastery. Perfect posture. Perfect answers. Perfect control. But Orion didn't care for control. He cared for truth. He knew when her hands trembled. He sensed when her mind wandered. He responded not to strength, but to surrender. The first time she tried to ride him, she followed every rule Silas hadn't given her. She approached with the saddle, clipped the girth tight, held the reins too firm, mounted like she was preparing for battle. Orion didn't buck. He didn't rear. He just walked 5 steps forward. And then bolted. The pasture swallowed them whole. Evelyn screamed, pulling hard on the reins. But Orion didn't stop. He galloped faster, cutting through the tall grass like a blade through water. She pulled again. He tossed his head. She leaned back. He veered sideways. And then, suddenly, he stopped. Midfield. Dead still. Evelyn, breathless and wild-eyed, slid off his back, landing hard in the dirt. Orion stood there, ears flicked back. Then turned away. And walked off. Slow. Calm. Dismissive. Silas never ran after them. He had been watching from the porch, arms crossed. When Evelyn limped back, mud on her knees and sweat on her spine, he handed her a bottle of water. "You stayed on longer than most." He threw me. "No," Silas said. "You lost him." Evelyn didn't reply. Didn't need to. She'd felt it, too. Not rejection. Just absence. That night, she didn't speak during dinner. Not out of shame. But reflection. She sat on the porch after Silas had gone to bed, watching the stars like they might rearrange themselves into answers. Orion was in the pasture, grazing as if nothing had happened. And maybe, nothing had. Not to him. But something in her had shifted. For the first time in her life, she realized she couldn't force her way into being trusted. She had to be honest. Not perfect. The next morning, she didn't bring a saddle. She didn't bring reins. She didn't bring a plan. She just brought herself. And sat. In the field. Cross-legged. Quiet. Near him. Not too near. Just enough to say, "I'm here. And I'm not asking anything today." Orion didn't approach. But he didn't walk away either. And that was enough. Over the next days, Evelyn did the same. She sat, read aloud from a book she found in the old barn, poetry, of all things. Sometimes she sang badly. Once she cried. Orion never judged her. He just stayed. One morning, 2 weeks after the fall, Orion walked to her, lowered his head, touched his nose to her chest, and stood, still, present, with her. Evelyn didn't move, didn't speak. She just let the moment be. Later that week, when she tried to mount again, she did it bareback. No reins. Just breath. She let her hands rest lightly on his mane. Her legs relaxed. Her heart steady. They moved, not fast, not far, but together. Silas watched from the distance, and for the first time in years, he smiled. Not because someone had ridden Orion, but because someone had listened to him. Really listened. To ride a horse, Evelyn had learned, was not to break it. It was to become soft enough that it chose to carry you. Orion never let her lead. He let her follow, and in doing so, she found something she never knew she'd lost. Herself. Untamed. Unmasked. Unafraid. The pasture was still glowing with the amber hue of early dusk. Orion had just finished his slow, steady walk with Evelyn bareback, no reins, no rush, just breath and trust. She slid down from his back gently, laughing under her breath like a child who had discovered flight. He nuzzled her side. And for a second, just 1 second, she felt like she had outrun everything that once defined her. But peace, as she was learning, isn't a place you arrive at. It's a place you choose. And sometimes, it's a place that still gets visited by ghosts. The sound came softly at first. A low hum. Not like Silas's old truck. Not like any farm equipment. It was too smooth. Too polished. Evelyn's heart tightened the moment she heard it. Somewhere in her body, something old remembered that sound. Orion lifted his head sharply, ears erect. Silas stepped out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, eyebrows furrowed. Down the gravel road, a black car appeared, sleek, expensive, wrong. Dust rose in its wake like a curtain about to be pulled back. It slowed near the gate. Stopped. Then, silence. A man stepped out. Mid-40s, clean-shaven, sharp jawline. Black button-down. Black slacks. Black leather shoes still shining despite the dirt. He didn't belong here, and he knew it. But he didn't care. He looked around like everything was a problem to be fixed. His gaze settled on Evelyn. He didn't blink. He didn't hesitate. He called her by a name she hadn't heard aloud in a long, long time. Miss Evelyn May Blackstone. The words struck like a slap. Evelyn froze. She didn't answer. But the name hung in the air like a noose being lowered. I represent your family's legal interests, the man continued, tone flat and cold. You've been off-grid for 10 days. Your absence has created concern. And liability. He reached into a black leather folder. Per your mother's request, I've brought a petition to begin the process of transferring temporary guardianship over your estate and person. As you are presently unfit to make decisions for yourself. He stepped forward, paper extended. Silas moved without a word. Not fast. Not aggressive. Just forward. He stood between the man and Evelyn. His presence said what no threat could. No further. The man gave a thin, almost amused smile. You must be Silas Granger. The horseman. He said it like it was an insult. But before Silas could speak, Orion moved. From the far side of the field, Orion trotted forward. No saddle. No rope. No command. He moved with purpose. And then, he stepped between Evelyn and the man in black. Head lowered. Muscles tight. Eyes locked. He didn't rear. Didn't charge. He just stood, like stone with breath. The man took a half step back, involuntarily. He's just a horse, he muttered. Silas's voice came slow, quiet, but iron hard. He knows what doesn't belong here. Evelyn's hands were shaking. Not because she feared the man. But because she feared what he represented. The chains she had shed. The life she hadn't chosen. The control she'd barely escaped. Her voice cracked as she asked, "How? How did you find me?" "Your mother never stopped tracking your location," the man replied without shame. "She's filed paperwork with the state court in New York. If you do not return willingly, legal mechanisms will proceed. You'll be escorted, evaluated, and placed back under family supervision." She looked at the paper in his hand. Legal. Clinical. Cold. Like she was a product. Like her absence was an error, not a choice. Evelyn's knees buckled slightly. Orion's flank brushed her side, steadying her. Silas turned. His voice was softer now. "Are you ready to fight for yourself?" Evelyn looked at him, eyes wide. "What if I lose?" "Then you'll lose," he said plainly. "But it'll be your loss. Not theirs. And you'll know. You finally stood up for the life you picked." The man in black held the papers out again. "You have until tomorrow morning. After that, we proceed without your consent." He stepped back toward the car, paused, looked at Orion, then Silas. "This world doesn't last," he said, almost gently. "She'll have to return to the real one eventually." "This is the real one," Silas said. "You're just too dead inside to see it." The car drove away. The dust stayed longer. But Evelyn didn't collapse. She didn't run. She didn't hide. She stood, heart thudding, hand on Orion's shoulder. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid of being seen. She just didn't want to be taken. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat on the porch, blanket over her shoulders, watching the darkness move like a tide. Silas joined her, coffee in hand. Neither spoke for a long while. Then, quietly, Evelyn asked, "What if I never go back? What if I fight them? What if I stay?" Silas looked out over the fields, then back at her. "Then you stop surviving. And you start living." The next morning rose slowly, as if unsure whether to follow the night that had just passed. Evelyn hadn't slept. Neither had Silas. And Orion, silent, steady, seemed to sense it all. He paced softly in his stall at dawn, hooves barely brushing the ground, like he was waiting for something. Or bracing for it. The black car hadn't come back. Not yet. But its shadow still lingered on the gravel road, long after its wheels had gone. Evelyn stood near the fence post, paper in hand. Legal. Official. Ruthless. A petition to erase her freedom in the name of protection. She read it one last time. Not for doubt. For closure. Then, quietly, deliberately, she tore it in half. Then again. And again. Until all that remained was a storm of shredded paper, floating down over the earth that had become her sanctuary. Silas watched from the porch. He didn't clap. Didn't cheer. He simply nodded once. As if to say, "Now. We begin." Later that day, Evelyn found him in the barn. He was sitting on the old bench near Orion's stall, a carving knife in his hand, working on a piece of aged oak. She stepped closer. "What are you doing?" He didn't look up. "Writing something that needed to exist." She moved around the side and saw the letters begin to take shape. Each curve slow. Each line deep. And then, there it was. Burned into the grain, rough and permanent. Evelyn May Cross. She stared at it for a long time. Longer than she meant to. It felt like looking at someone she hadn't met yet. But had always been. "That name yours?" Silas asked softly. She took a deep breath. "Blackstone was never mine. It belonged to their expectations. Their legacy. Their control." She reached out, ran her fingers over the carved letters. They bit her skin. Rough, real, and grounding. "Cross. Feels like something I earned. Not something I inherited." Silas nodded. "Then that's the one we hang." That afternoon, together, they hung the oak plaque on Orion's stall. The horse watched silently, blinking slowly, like he understood the ceremony of it. The barn smelled of hay and sweat and something sacred. As the final nail sank in, Evelyn stepped back, her breath trembling. "This is my home," she said quietly. "For the first time in my life. I chose something. Not for survival. Not for appearance. But because it feels like mine." Silas placed his hand gently on the frame. Then welcome home, Evelyn Cross. That night, Evelyn sat by herself in the field under a sky filled with stars that didn't judge. Orion stood nearby, his breath misting gently in the cool air. She looked up at the sky and whispered, "I don't know what tomorrow brings. But for the first time, I'm not afraid to face it as me." She looked at Orion. "You knew, didn't you? From the moment I touched your mane. You knew I didn't belong to them." Orion nuzzled her shoulder. And Evelyn Cross smiled. Not because the world had changed, but because she had. The oak plaque hung on Orion's stall, catching the afternoon light like a quiet declaration. Evelyn May Cross. No longer a name assigned. No longer a life inherited. But one chosen, etched in wood and memory. And in the days that followed, the ranch didn't change much. But Evelyn did. Not with fireworks. But like a tree, growing roots before anyone sees the bloom. She began to rise earlier, sometimes even before Silas. She fed the chickens before they had time to complain. Learned how to stack hay without toppling herself. Learned the rhythm of the land, of tools, of breath. There was no "you should." No, this is how we do things. Just quiet work. And the comfort of knowing your hands were needed, not to be perfect, but to be present. One morning, Silas was halfway up the roof, hammer in hand, when Evelyn climbed the ladder behind him. "You could have waited till I fell," he said without turning. "Where's the fun in that?" She grinned, handing him a fresh nail. They spent hours replacing cracked shingles under the noon sun. Evelyn's palms blistered. Silas's back ached. But they worked like two people who'd been fixing things together for years, without ever needing to fix each other. Later that week, they planted sunflowers along the fence. Not because the land needed beauty, but because they did. Evelyn knelt in the dirt, sleeves rolled up, tracing her fingers through the soil like it held forgotten stories. Silas worked quietly beside her, placing each seed with care. At one point, she looked up and asked, "You always this gentle?" He paused. "I've been cruel. But not to the land." She didn't press. She didn't have to. She understood. Sometimes, kindness isn't born from innocence. It's what you fight to keep after the world's taken everything else. Each afternoon, she took Orion down to the creek. She walked beside him at first, through shallow water, listening to the soft clinks of stones beneath his hooves. One day, she rode him through. No saddle. No reins. He trusted her now. And she'd learned to let go. At night, in the old guest room with the window cracked open, Evelyn began writing again. In a leather-bound notebook Silas had left by the porch swing one evening without a word. She wrote not about what she'd run from, but about what she was finding. She drew Orion in the margins. Sketched the curve of his scar. The way his ears tilted when he listened. The way Silas's hands held tools, not tightly, but with a kind of respect. She wrote about quiet strength. The kind that didn't roar, but didn't bend either. One evening, as fireflies blinked across the pasture, Evelyn handed Silas a drawing. It was Orion. Standing tall. Behind him, a shadow, burning. And beside him, a woman with her hand on his neck. Face not detailed. Just still. Silas stared at it for a long time. "That's not just a picture of him," he said finally. "No," Evelyn replied. "It's a picture of survival." The days bled together, not because they were the same, but because they belonged to her now. And in the quiet of doing things with someone who didn't ask too much, Evelyn started to remember. A flash of a childhood. Running through a dusty pasture barefoot. A red pony named Jasper. A grandfather who whistled while mending leather straps. She hadn't thought about those memories in years. Buried beneath schedules. Contracts. Public appearances. Now they surfaced in fragments. Memories, like roots, growing back into the girl she used to be. Silas, too, changed. Not drastically. But his silences became warmer. His glances lingered a moment longer. One night, they sat by the fire, and he said, "You remind me of Nora sometimes." She looked over. "Your wife?" He nodded. "Not in looks. In how you stay. Even after you've been broken." Evelyn swallowed. Maybe we don't stay in spite of the breaking. Maybe we stay because we finally stopped running from it. He smiled then, tired, quiet, but full. That sounds like something Nora would have said. They didn't touch. Didn't kiss. Didn't need to. The space between them wasn't empty. It was earned. The sun had begun to set earlier these days, casting long shadows over the land, making everything feel quieter, heavier. The leaves were turning, too, orange, yellow, and red, the vibrant colors of change. It felt like the earth itself was adjusting to something new. Something Evelyn had not only chosen, but claimed as hers. The barn doors creaked as she entered, a faint smile touching her lips as she passed the plaque with her name, Evelyn May Cross, her name, finally her own. She touched the wood as she did every morning. It had become part of the rhythm of her life, a steady reminder of what she had fought for, and won. Orion was already in the pasture, grazing quietly, his coat a mix of shadows and golden light. Evelyn walked over to him, running her fingers along his mane. He nuzzled her hand, warm and comforting, his steady presence offering her the silent support she needed. And yet, the feeling that had been with her for weeks, of finally being at peace, was about to shatter. The car arrived just after noon. It wasn't the familiar, comforting hum of Silas's truck or the calm of an old farm vehicle. This car, black, sleek, polished, looked like a dagger driven into the soft earth of her new life. Her heart dropped in her chest as the car rolled slowly down the gravel road, tires kicking up dust that seemed to swirl around her, suffocating her. Evelyn stopped walking. Her fingers curled into fists. Not because she feared what was coming, she feared what it meant. She had fought for this life. She had built this life. And now, the past was coming to claim it. The car stopped at the gate, and the door opened before it even fully rolled to a stop. A woman stepped out. Evelyn's mother. Dressed in an immaculate navy dress, high heels that had no place on this land, her presence like a shadow from a world Evelyn had fought to escape. Behind her, the ever-present figure of her family's lawyer, tall and stiff, looking as if the entire world was an equation waiting to be solved. Evelyn didn't need to see the papers in the lawyer's hand. She already knew. "Evelyn," her mother said coldly, her voice as sharp and perfect as her appearance, "you're coming home." Evelyn could feel her breath tighten in her throat. She stood frozen, caught between the woman she once called mother and the woman she had become. Her mother continued, the words flowing effortlessly, as if this was an ordinary conversation. "Your absence has gone on long enough. This is no longer a matter of choice. The papers are in order, and your legal guardianship is reinstated, effective immediately. You will return to the city, and we will resume your engagement. Your future is already decided." Evelyn felt her pulse hammering in her chest, her mind screaming, but her body refusing to move. She had lived under her mother's control for years. But the woman in front of her was no longer her mother. She was a ghost. And Evelyn wasn't afraid of ghosts anymore. Silas had heard the car arrive and had walked toward the gate, standing at a distance behind Evelyn, observing the confrontation with the calmness that came from years of burying his own pain. Evelyn turned to him, her eyes sharp but steady. He didn't need to speak. He only nodded, offering his silent support. And that's when the papers, the same legal papers that had been shoved in front of her countless times, were handed to her. She stared at them for a long time, letting the weight of those words sink in. Evelyn May Blackstone. Her family's name. Her inheritance. Her curse. With shaking hands, she reached for the paper, ripping it in half, her eyes locked on her mother's. Her mother's expression faltered, just for a moment. But Evelyn didn't give her the chance to speak. "If I am a name," she said, voice shaking but determined, "then I will choose my own." She held the torn pieces of the paper high, watching the pieces flutter in the wind. "I am not a Blackstone anymore." Her mother stepped forward, her face a mask of fury. Her voice came low, venomous. "You are mine. Everything you are, everything you have, is because of me. I gave you everything." But Evelyn didn't flinch. "No," she said, her voice stronger, more certain than ever. "You gave me a life I didn't want. A name that didn't fit me. and a future that was never mine to choose. She threw the torn papers to the ground at her mother's feet. "I'm not going back, and you can't make me. I am Evelyn Maycross. And that is the only name I'll answer to from now on." For a long moment, there was silence. The air was thick with it. Her mother's eyes narrowed, her fists clenched. The lawyer stood behind her, watching the scene unfold with no expression. He didn't dare speak. Evelyn took a step forward, eyes never leaving her mother's. "You can't take what you didn't give me. And you never had a right to it." And with that, she turned away. Walked past her mother and the lawyer. Walked toward Silas, who stood by the gate, watching her with those quiet, knowing eyes. Her mother called out to her, but she didn't stop. Didn't turn around. "Evelyn. May. Blackstone." Evelyn crossed the threshold of the gate and stopped. She stood tall, chest rising with the weight of everything she had said, everything she had done. And then, softly, but firmly, she whispered, "I'm sorry, Mother. But I'm not your daughter anymore." With one last glance at the broken papers on the ground, Evelyn reached out and took Silas's hand. For the first time in her life, she felt the weight of freedom, real, heavy, and pure. And the past? The past was finally behind her. The future? It was hers to shape. Evelyn had made her choice. She had torn the past in two, not to erase it, but to own it. With Silas by her side, she'd carved a name into the oak, a name that was hers, unburdened by her mother's demands, untainted by a legacy that wasn't hers to claim. But there was one thing left. One thing she could never run from, the eyes of the town. The Harvest Festival was approaching, the annual celebration marking the end of the season, when the town would gather for contests, dancing, food, and of course, the annual horse race. Silas had mentioned it in passing. The town had always made a spectacle of the event, drawing competitors from all around the region. But Evelyn didn't think much about it. That is, until she found herself standing near the barn, looking at Orion. "You should enter," Silas said one evening as the golden sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the barn and the pasture in shades of amber. Evelyn's hands were still dusty from the day's work, but she wiped them on her jeans and met his gaze. "Me? In the race? Why not? You've spent enough time with him. You've been riding him almost every day." She looked at Orion, grazing peacefully in the field. He was strong, graceful, but wild in his own way. "I'm not sure I belong there," she said softly, not sure why she felt hesitant. Not in front of people. Not to win. Silas stepped closer, his eyes steady. "It's not about winning, Evelyn. It's about showing them who you really are. And showing yourself." For the first time, in front of everyone. The race was held in the heart of the town. The dirt track wound around the main square, the bleachers packed with eager faces, all watching with anticipation. The air was heavy with the hum of excitement, 1,000 eyes scanning the participants as they lined up. Evelyn stood near the fence, Orion tethered beside her, his coat shining under the autumn sun. Her heart was pounding, not from nerves, but from a quiet certainty. The race wasn't for a trophy. It wasn't for approval. It wasn't even for a prize. It was for something only she could understand. The other riders were already mounted on their horses, sleek and polished, their outfits pristine and designed for attention. Evelyn, in her worn jeans and a faded shirt, stood out like a pebble among pearls. She didn't belong in this scene. But she wasn't trying to. She looked at Orion, her steady companion. He met her gaze, his large eyes soft with understanding. She didn't need to say anything. He already knew. As the race began, the horses shot forward in a blur of speed and dust. Evelyn hesitated for a split second before mounting Orion. No saddle. No reins. No fear. Her hands rested lightly on his neck, her body in tune with his rhythm. The others raced ahead, pushing their horses hard, but Evelyn and Orion moved as one. At first, everything felt perfect. The wind in her face. The thrill of the speed. The hum of the crowd. But then, something shifted. Orion's ears twitched. His breath quickened. And suddenly, without warning, he bolted. He wasn't throwing her off. He wasn't trying to buck. He was running, faster than he ever had. The crowd gasped. The other riders glanced over, startled by the wildness in his movements. Evelyn's heart skipped, but she didn't panic. She didn't pull the reins. Her hands stayed light. Her legs stayed relaxed. She spoke his name, just once. Orion. The horse didn't stop. He was running. Running as if the earth had opened beneath him and he was finally free to let go. Evelyn whispered his name again. Her fingers brushed his neck, just above the sweat. She didn't try to control him. She didn't pull him back. She let go. Orion. Her voice was soft, a breath on the wind. And then, as if something between them clicked, Orion slowed. It wasn't a sharp stop. It wasn't forced. It was a choice. He came to a soft halt in the middle of the track, standing tall and still. His chest heaved, but his body relaxed. The crowd went silent. Evelyn didn't care. She didn't need their approval. She didn't win the race. She wasn't even close. But as she sat there on Orion's back, staring ahead, something inside her finally shifted. She had finally understood. The freedom was never in winning. It was in the trust. The trust she had built with Orion. The trust she had built in herself. As Evelyn dismounted, the crowd began to murmur. She stood tall, wiping the dirt off her jeans, her head held high. No one approached her at first. No one knew what to say. The silence in the air was thick, almost reverent. Then, a voice broke through. "Well done, Miss Cross." Evelyn turned to see one of the older men from town, a local farmer, nodding to her. His eyes held no mockery, only a quiet acknowledgement. And as the other slowly came forward, something shifted. They didn't see her as the Blackstone girl anymore. They saw her as Evelyn May Cross, not the name on a paper, not a legacy to fulfill, but a person who had finally stepped out into the world on her own terms. Later that evening, as the festival wound down, Evelyn walked back to the barn with Orion by her side. Silas followed at a distance, watching her with a quiet pride. When they reached the stall, Evelyn paused and looked at the horse that had carried her through every victory and failure, every doubt and every triumph. "We didn't win the race," she whispered to Orion. "But we found something better, didn't we?" Orion nickered softly, his eyes calm and knowing. And in that moment, Evelyn understood. She didn't need to prove herself. She didn't need to win. She just needed to be. The sun had started to dip lower each evening, but this time, it didn't feel like the end of something. For the first time in her life, Evelyn felt like she was standing at the beginning of something all her own. The festival had ended, the streets emptying as the last of the lights flickered out. The quiet after the chaos was familiar, but this time, it wasn't an emptiness she feared. It was peace. And peace, Evelyn was learning, was earned. Not given. Not a gift from the world, but a result of choosing to stand firm and claim the space where she truly belonged. As the weeks passed, the rhythm of life at the farm settled into a comfortable routine. Evelyn spent her days working alongside Silas, mending fences, fixing the barn roof, and learning more about the land and the life she had chosen to embrace. But something had shifted in her. The work had never felt like a burden, but now, it felt like a mission, a purpose. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was building. And this time, it was with her own hands. Orion remained by her side. His presence was a reminder of what they'd both fought through, his scar, her past, their shared understanding that freedom wasn't just about escaping, it was about choosing to stay. One day, as she walked alongside Orion, a thought crossed her mind that had been lingering there for weeks. She wanted to give back. To teach. To share what she had learned, not just with horses, but with the children who had never experienced the kind of freedom she now understood. And so, Evelyn made a decision that would change the course of her life forever. She opened a riding school for children. Not just for the rich or the privileged, but for anyone who wanted to learn, who wanted to experience the same kind of connection she had with Orion. She would teach them not just how to ride, but how to trust, how to listen, and most importantly, how to choose their own path. The first day, the children arrived in their best clothes, unsure and curious. Their parents stood behind them, some skeptical, others eager for something more than what the city offered. Evelyn stood tall by the fence, Orion by her side. She didn't need a podium. She didn't need to say much. She simply started, showing the children the quiet connection that could exist between horse and rider. No shouting. No force. Just patience. Just presence. Silas watched from the barn door as Evelyn worked with the children. He could see the change in her, not in the way she moved, but in the way she held the space. She was no longer the girl who was afraid of being seen. Now, she was the woman who invited others to step into the light alongside her. At the end of that first day, Evelyn walked up to Silas, wiping her hands on her jeans, her smile a little brighter. "I think they learned something today," she said, her voice still holding that calm certainty that had become her signature. Silas smiled back, his voice quiet but full of warmth. "And you did too. You gave them more than a lesson. You gave them hope." Days turned into weeks. The school grew. Children came, not just from the town, but from neighboring farms, and eventually, even from the city. And with each lesson, each horse they rode, Evelyn saw not just the children changing, but herself. She was building more than a riding school. She was building a legacy. A life she could be proud of. Not because of her name, not because of her family, but because of what she had created with her own hands, her own heart. One afternoon, after a long day of lessons, Silas handed her the keys to the barn. "Finally. It's yours now," he said quietly. "All of it. The barn. The land. Orion." Evelyn's hand shook slightly as she took the keys. Not because she was afraid, but because she knew this was the moment when she stopped being a guest in her own life. This was her home. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never thought I could have this." "You earned it," Silas said simply, stepping back to give her space. That night, as Evelyn sat on the porch, Orion resting beside her, a letter arrived. It was from her family. From the Blackstone estate. Her hands trembled as she saw the name on the envelope. Blackstone. She didn't open it. Not because she was afraid. But because she already knew what it would say. It would ask her to return. To come back to their life. The life that was never hers to claim. She placed the letter on the table and stared out into the field, where the sunflowers were now tall and proud, just like her. For a moment, she thought about what would have happened if she had gone back. If she had let them make her who they wanted her to be. But she had chosen a different path. A better path. Evelyn stood up, walked out to the hill, and looked down at the land she had made her own. Orion followed her, his hooves silent in the soft grass. The wind whispered through the sunflowers, carrying the scent of earth and freedom. She sat on the top of the hill, Orion beside her, and watched the sun set over the fields, casting the world in golden hues. This was her choice. This was her life. And as she looked out over the land, she knew, for the first time in her life, that she was free. Freedom is not about running away, it's about daring to face yourself and choosing the path you truly want to walk. To be free, sometimes you have to let go of the old things, the names others have given you. Freedom is the right to be yourself, to choose the life you want to live, even if that path is difficult, even if you have to face the unknown.